From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters. It's 1 a.m. In the pitch darkness of my bedroom, there's a blinding beacon of light coming from my phone. Why am I up? Well, I'm doom scrolling again. And I know you're probably doing the same thing too. The feeds on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook are endless, and nearly everything we see on social media feels bad. Rising COVID-19 cases and death tolls. A U.S. president continues to downplay the situation.
Right here, the United States is lowest in numerous categories. We're lower than the world.
Lower than the
lower
world?
than
What is that?
Europe.
In what? In what?
Then there's the long overdue reckoning over racism and class inequality in our society. Daily fights over public health protocols and mask wearing. Oh, and remember climate change? Yeah, that's still happening. It's all really hard to look at, but it might be harder to turn away. We're witnessing a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week car crash on our phones, and we can't get enough of it. We keep reading stories and watching videos of it all. That is the definition of doom scrolling. It takes a toll on your mental health. Today, we're talking to Navneet Alang, a writer whose work on tech, culture, and food has appeared in The Atlantic, The Walrus, and Maclean's. He also writes the tech column for us here at the Toronto Star. Nav, like me, and like you, is online. A lot. We're going to talk about this terrible habit of doom scrolling and how maybe you can stop. Nav, it's nice to talk to you.
Yeah, it's nice to talk to you too, Adrian.
So I'm going to admit, I personally do a lot of doom scrolling. I really can't help myself. And my personal go-to excuse is, well, it's part of my job working in news. What does your doom scrolling look like?
I mean, it's pretty intense just because, I also work in media and I also just tend to spend most of my life on Twitter. And that's really the key thing is Twitter, I think, is kind of the home of doom scrolling. And it really tends to be me at all hours of the day and night, flipping through my phone, having imaginary arguments in my head with people, or just being horrified by, the latest bit of news to come out. But yeah, that sort of has been my experience for the past few months, definitely.
It definitely seems like everything that you see next gets worse. The news is all bad. It's all consuming. It never really stops. Is there something that you try to find new details on? Is there like a particular story that you're really tracking?
Yeah, I think it really became intense with coronavirus. I think partly because everyone was home all the time, right? So you didn't have much to do except to inform yourself. But it was also like a new kind of social phenomenon, right? So you wanted to find out, what was the appropriate way to act? Like, how are you supposed to behave when you go to a grocery store? But then you also wanted to know things like, well, what's happening in China? What's happening in the US? And so it was sort of this really intense need to find out things on both kind of a human scale, but also this sort of international scale as well. And so like the coronavirus for me was the big one. But I think that over the past few years, like the Trump presidency has really kind of glued people to their screens, right? I think John Mulaney has a bit about this in his Netflix special about, you walk around and you're constantly thinking like, what has the president done now?
Yeah.
And so those stories, I think, have really kind of occupied my time.
How does it make you feel after you keep refreshing the timeline and you keep seeing stories about President Trump, you see stories about the coronavirus, we're learning new things about that. We're seeing stories about racial inequality, protests. Of course, you're taking in all this information, but how does it feel in your gut when you doom scroll?
Oh my God, horrible. All the time.
Terrible.
But it's a funny kind of, normally if doing something makes you feel horrible, you stop doing it. But when you're on social media, you just keep doing it all the time. And I feel like that is the sort of like the mental health risk in social media, right? I think that it seems to kind of come out of this desire to empower yourself through knowing what's going on, right? Like that's the feeling that we get when we watch the news, right? It's like, well, I may not be able to control the news, but at least I know what's going on. It's almost like the persistence of social media, like the fact that it's going 24 hours a day and it's in your pocket makes it sort of extra draining, which is why I end up feeling, terrible, or talking to a therapist, or, I'm on medication or something like that,
I mean, we work in media, and so we're partially culpable, but I was reading about how a researcher at Harvard School of Public Health was saying how our brains are often hardwired to pay attention to negative news as opposed to some of the more positive stuff that's going on. And especially right now with so much that's going on with such high stakes, do you think that impulse to seek out information, and especially a lot of bad information, do you think that impulse has gotten worse for some of us during quarantine?
Yeah, I do think so. Because, as I was saying, like, there is that sort of desire to inform yourself. But the other thing that I think that and there have been some studies that suggest this, that the other thing that our brains are hardwired for is just to seek out novelty, right? Like, we want new information constantly because it feels like the more up-to-date the information is, then the more accurate it is. So I feel like that kind of dynamic has kind of created this situation where you're constantly, as you say, doom scrolling. And that just seems to make the whole situation worse rather than better. That might exaggerate the situation slightly, but it certainly feels that way sometimes.
When did you realize that doom scrolling was really a thing that we were all doing in quarantine? That, of course, things are bad. I really can't stop reading the news. But then also that realization, everybody else on my timeline too, they're also doing the same thing. We're all feeling kind of bad about what's going on. When did that click for you?
I think it was quite early on, actually. It's easy sometimes when you're sitting in front of your screen to think that you're the only person that is doing whatever, binge watching this particular show on Netflix or looking at this particular website. I guess one of the upsides of social media is that communal aspect of it. And so in between, kind of interspersed with all the, the terrible news, was these sort of statements from other people being like, wow, I can't stop looking at Twitter. Like, I'm constantly doing this and it's making me feel terrible. So I think it was honestly like as early as March that I sort of started to notice that we were all doing this to ourselves.
Is there a time of day that you catch yourself doing it? I mean, for me, it's always right in the morning where I feel like that's part of my Twitter habit of pulling it up and reading the news in the morning, and then right before I go to bed, which seems completely counterproductive to actually getting sleep. Is there a period of time where you find yourself, right, I'm sinking into this rabbit hole?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny when you mention that, I think about there was a tweet from a few years ago that went something to the effect of, let's see what fresh horrors await me on the fresh horrors device.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember that, but like it really does feel that that's what you're doing. Every time you kind of flip open your phone, it's just like, well, what fresh horrors await me now? And I think like you, it is very much like, it's like first thing in the morning so that you have a sense, okay, this is what is going on today. This is what people are talking about today. And then also at night, which, as you say, doesn't make any sense. Like, I can't do anything about it at 1 o'clock in the morning, but for some reason I fill my brain with information at that time.
Does this moment at all feel like a bit of a catch-22 for you, especially covering tech? I mean, screens and social media, they dominate our lives now, of course. They're part of our lives. And it's also one of the few safe ways that we can keep in touch with family and friends. But like you're saying, it's a fresh horror device that, in addition to connecting you with people, there's also just a lot of bad, sad stuff that goes on. How do you create balance in that?
Yes, it's a good question. I was actually just thinking about this, that one of the weird things about devices with screens is the way that they like collapse a whole bunch of things that used to be separate into the same object, right? So it's the same object that gets you the news, that connects you to your friends. You can use it to order food. You can use it to find a date. All of these things are all on this sort of same device. So that question of like, how do you find balance becomes really complicated, because if you say, okay, well, I'm not going to look at my phone, it doesn't just mean I'm not looking at the news. It also means I'm not going to get messages from my friends, right?
It cuts you off from a lot of other things that have nothing to do with news or anything else that's going on.
Yeah. So I think that there are a couple of ways to kind of find some balance. I think one is sort of the more extreme way, and it is to try and be really rigorous about things and try and, get social media and news apps off of your phone. It absolutely insists that, like on the weekend that you don't look at the internet at all, those kinds of things. But I think that perhaps a more sort of practical approach is to say to yourself, okay, it's 11 o'clock. I'm going to try and go to bed. I'm going to put my phone 10 feet away and maybe look at a book or something. I think that finding a balance in a strange way kind of requires this sort of weird kind of like technical literacy. Like you have to be like, okay, I'm going to turn notifications off on this app. I'm going to mute this group chat. But it's all about, I think, finding a way to use your digital devices as a way to connect with other human beings or things that make you happy, while mitigating some of the more kind of intense negative effects of it.
Like figuring out how to use your phone on your terms rather than this tidal wave of information from all corners that you really have to section it off.
I think that's a really good way to put it. Like, especially when you think that the way that a lot of apps are structured is exactly to get you to pay attention as much as possible, right? Like, there's a reason that Facebook and Twitter use engagement as the metric for measuring how well they're doing, right? It's how much time do you spend paying attention to them. So I think that until there's some sort of bigger structural shift, it requires on an individual basis that, you have to try and almost kind of resist the way in which technology is designed currently, in 2020.
Especially as a writer and a reporter, I wonder if you feel something similar to what I feel, in that, I feel a need to stay on top of the news all the time because I need to know what's happening, what's going on, so that we can have hopefully intelligent conversations rather than, Twitter shouting matches, but wanting to be informed, but at the same time also knowing, okay, this is pretty destructive for my mental health if I'm on this all the time. Do you have anything different that as a reporter that you think about wanting to create space?
Yes, in theory.
I'm mostly asking for myself, like any tips that you got for me.
I think after Trump was elected in November of 2016 and Twitter became a tire fire, I actually deleted Twitter off my phone. And just that made a significant difference. But it is very difficult when either you work in media or you're just a news junkie. You just sort of get stuck in it. And, and I know that I've definitely had friends look at me with almost pity in their eyes, being like, well, if it's making you miserable, just stop using it. Well, I can't because I have to know what's going on. I'm not sure that I have found a great way, except for sort of like periodic extreme measures of like, okay, I'm not going to look at Twitter this entire weekend or something like that.
I don't know if it works at all, but sometimes I find myself down a weird rabbit hole. And then I kind of take a step back on the story and I'm like, how would I explain this to my parents? How many layers would I have to go through to explain this to them? And if it's like more than 5, you're too far. You're way too deep in.
Yeah, and that's a really good kind of like gut check, particularly because I think that Twitter in particular has its own discourse and it has its own layers of conversation. And I think you have to remind yourself that it can be pretty disconnected from the rest of the world sometimes.
Do you think that there's anything good about this time, about maybe not necessarily doom scrolling, but how online we are? Has it started some pretty important conversations around obviously public health, but also about racial and class inequality during this time? Is there anything good about doom scrolling?
Definitely, there's something good about social media in this moment, right? And I think that this is the really kind of difficult thing, particularly like as somebody who writes about technology, I spent a lot of kind of my early career defending technology, like from, this sort of going back to the days when everyone would sort of dismiss Twitter as being the place that people used to say, this is what I had for lunch, right? And so I think in this particular moment with sort of the Black Lives Matter protests and a sort of a growing awareness of, what were once pretty radical ideas about, like police abolitionism or defunding the police have been pushed into the mainstream by, Black activists on Twitter. And I think that obviously is a really positive thing. But it does sort of speak to that fundamental ambivalence about social media, right? Like that it can do these incredible things while it also has these really negative effects. And I think that historically, because it's so new, we're still in the process of working out how do we accentuate one and reduce the effects of the other.
Following different social media apps, do you find that there's a different kind of tone depending on who you're on? Obviously we're both on Twitter. We can see how toxic it is. Do you see a big difference between how people talk on Twitter versus TikTok versus Instagram? Do you find that the conversations are different depending on the platform?
Yeah, very much so. So scholars of technology talk about affordances of technology. And what they mean is that different technologies or different forms of media lend themselves to different effects or different cultures. And so, for example, I think the vibe on TikTok, even though it's still quite political at times, is definitely very different than it is on Twitter. Like there's a lot more humor, there's a lot more kind of creativity, and there's a lot more sort of room to kind of make mistakes as opposed to Twitter. Instagram, I think, tends to not be as political. That changed somewhat during the Black Lives Matter protests, but it still is a place I think that people turn to sometimes to get away from the politics. So kind of connect back to what we were talking about earlier, like how do you kind of find a balance between things? It may be that, that you kind of lean towards one particular social media app when you need a particular thing in your life. I know that I, for example, keep on going on and on about TikTok, and my friends keep telling me to shut up about TikTok, but it can really be quite a relief if you need a break from the intensity of something like Twitter.
Right. That in comparison, TikTok is a bit of a reprieve considering some of the toxicity that we see and we hear about on Twitter often.
Yeah, and you don't get the intense back and forth exchanges, right? Like one of the things that is so draining about Twitter in particular is that you aren't just getting bad news, but you're seeing people argue about the bad news constantly, right? Like that can be kind of emotionally draining on its own level, particularly when you're watching friends of yours argue back and forth, right? It's like watching your parents fight in a way. Do you know what I mean? Like you just kind of feel like, please stop. But yeah, so that's why I think that notion of affordances can be helpful, because you can think about, well, maybe I just don't want to see people fight, so let me go to TikTok and watch people dance or make little comedic videos.
That's really interesting. Even in before times, let's call it the before times of pre-pandemic. And, I was thinking about how social media rewires our brains a bit. It changes what we expect out of a social interaction, or maybe the ways that we talk to each other online. And at the same time, right now, it's also getting really hard. We're getting Zoom fatigue. We're deleting Twitter off our phones because we need a little bit of a break from it. Do you think that given that this pandemic and potentially bad news upon bad news will continue for a while, do you think we're starting to figure this thing out? Are we getting better at this doom scrolling thing?
It's a good question. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that what the pandemic has done is that it has accelerated a lot of things, right? So I think that it has accelerated, for example, the use of technology by a broad swath of people across the globe, right? Because so many people are working from home or they're forced to kind of connect online. But I think that in terms of how social media restructures our brains, I think that that is a relatively sort of long process, right? So if you think about social media as being somehow analogous to the printing press, the effect that had on the way that we communicate and the way that we think and kind of like the structure of the human mind, that took a long time. And so I think social media is going to happen faster because everything happens faster in the digital age. But I think that the pandemic may be sort of the beginning of that kind of reckoning, but I think it's going to continue on for the next few years or the next few decades, much more likely.
Yeah, looking back, maybe in retrospect, in a few years, we'll see this as sort of a moment where we were actually beginning to figure out how we use social media rather than maybe in the middle of it. Our concept of time will probably change a lot over the next few years about this.
Yeah, I think so. As much as the pandemic has sort of affected our sense of time, like everyone sort of says, like, how is it possibly August already? And I know that I feel like it should still only be April. I think that it is probably going to be a significant moment that just in social media, let alone all of the other things that the pandemic has affected.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. That was great.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting.
That is Navneet Alang, writer of tech, culture, and food, and also a tech columnist for the Toronto Star. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.